Hey guys, how's it going? As I stated in the previous few videos, we'll be continuing our series on each theatrically released Spider-Man film. And as I'm sure as the title suggests, we'll be diving into arguably the worst Spider-Man film ever made in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. This film really is a mess. So much of a mess that I actually think the first Amazing Spider-Man gets underrated simply off of how bad this movie was. The Sam Raimi trilogy was very campy and a bit over the top, so I understand why Sony thought a much darker take on the character was necessary, but this film is just too dark. Starting the film off with Peter's parents dying in a brutal plane crash is just unnecessary. I know they tie his parents' disappearance into the story quite a bit, but I just don't think it should be this prevalent. I personally think Spider-Man works best as an average man who is simply using the great power he received to do as much good for his community as he can. But this film seemed determined to make him into a Batman-esque detective obsessed with his parents' death, and I believe the film would have been better off if this plot thread was just completely removed. Now, as currently constructed, Electro is a horrible villain, but I do think his story could have worked. He's a massive fan of Spider-Man who kinda takes the fandom too far. Kind of think of if Stan from that Eminem song had developed superpowers. I actually think this could have worked, as it provides a good opportunity to force Spider-Man to reflect on his actions and the influence he has on others, and is similar to the start of Syndrome's villain arc from The Incredibles, but we don't really get to see any of that potential realized. Instead, Max gets his powers in the most contrived way possible, by falling into a vat of electric eels that for some reason fix his gap teeth and give him the power to control electricity. There's moments where he's a sympathetic villain, but overall he kinda comes off as a joke more times than not, and while the CGI of his electricity looks pretty cool, he's just never too intimidating of a force. Now, if you want to talk about contrived storylines, we can get into the Harry plotline. Who the hell is this guy? Peter's best friend? Did this movie forget that Peter was a nerdy loner in the first film? I know this film states that, they haven't spoken in like 8 years or so, but Harry getting flung into the story in this way just feels really forced, and I just couldn't care less about it. Him needing Spider-Man's DNA is just dumb. I know this is a superhero film and suspension of disbelief is needed, but I just can't buy a genetic disorder that turns your skin green and makes you grow claws. The character design of him as Hobgoblin is also just atrocious. I mean, dear lord, they did him dirty with that look. The only bright spot of the screen time he gets is the laughably bad scene where he screams, "You're a fraud, Spider-Man," which is extremely memeable at least. But again, as a main antagonist, Harry just isn't set up well enough. It also feels a bit weird to see Hobgoblin yet again when we just saw a Hobgoblin 2 Spider-Man films ago. One that was far better set up across multiple films as well. One thing that I didn't mention in my breakdown of the first Amazing Spider-Man was the dynamic between Peter and Captain Stacy. I think the clash of ideologies between the two is really interesting, and the promise he made to Captain Stacy before his death weighs heavily on this film. Peter promised he'd keep Gwen out of it, and he keeps having visions of Captain Stacy reminding him of his promise. But he loves Gwen and can't seem to leave her alone. He wants to honor his promise and to protect Gwen, but he doesn't know if that means being in her life to save her, or if it means staying out of her life so she won't need saving at all. This conflict is easily the best part of the film, and the on-screen chemistry between Gwen and Peter is still very strong in this movie. This romantic chemistry also makes the climactic death of Gwen in this film much more heartbreaking, as Peter just couldn't save her in the end no matter what he did. If everything else in this movie had been given the same emotional weight and attention that this storyline received, we could have had something special. A film that focused more on the Gwen and Peter romance, gave Electro a less goofy backstory, and cut Harry and Peter's parents out of the movie entirely, could have been great. In this version, killing Gwen could have been Electro's way of breaking Spider-Man the same way that he was mentally broken by society. And seeing Peter wallow in the sorrows of losing his girlfriend and breaking his promise could have made for an even more triumphant rise, as he would eventually put the mask back on to stop Electro and become the hero he couldn't be for Gwen. All in all, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 definitely had the potential to be great, as the Peter and Gwen romance was truly engaging and more than capable of carrying the bulk of a Spider-Man film, but unfortunately a half-baked script, Two mediocre villains, unnecessary Sinister Six setup, and unneeded plot lines really prevent this film from reaching most of its potential. And I think I can confidently say that it is the weakest theatrically released Spider-Man film, and brought the Andrew Garfield era of the character to a lackluster close. If you enjoyed this breakdown of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and are interested in further explorations of screen stories, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe. And if you feel like I missed anything, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.